What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is Jeffrey Sachs, a world-renowned economist, best-selling author, and professor at Columbia University, where he was the former director of the Earth Institute. Dr. Sachs last appeared on the podcast about a month ago to discuss his criticisms of the U.S. intelligence community and American foreign policy. Our conversation was cut short, and I asked him back on the podcast to discuss his central critique of U.S. foreign policy as it pertains primarily to the breakdown in U.S.-Russia relations and the war in Ukraine. As I mentioned in our previous conversation, I have immense respect for Dr. Sachs' experience as a diplomat, as an educator, and as a critic of U.S. foreign policy. And I wanted to understand his views better and, where appropriate, challenge some of them, as well as some of his underlying assumptions about where and why things went wrong in Washington's relationship with Moscow. We discuss much of the relevant post-Cold War history, including NATO enlargement, the breakdown in arms control, the invasions of Georgia and Ukraine, and why America's confrontational policies towards Russia are to blame when our more accommodative policies towards China in the 1990s and early 2000s failed to produce the opposite result. If you enjoy this podcast and it brings valuable insights to your life and business, consider joining our premium feed, where you'll gain access to subscriber-only podcasts, early releases, extended episode content, transcripts, and intelligence reports at hiddenforces.io/subscribe. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy part 2 of my conversation about America's national security state, foreign policy, and the war in Ukraine with my guest, Jeffrey Sachs. Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, welcome back to Hidden Forces.
Great to be with you. Thanks a lot.
Great. So this is a part 2 of our conversation. Part 1 we did, I think, like almost a month ago, not even. And I actually reviewed that conversation because it was a little while ago, some weeks ago. I reviewed it before our call today, and I'm going to pick up where we left off, which was we had finished discussing your career, your experience as a diplomat, as a development economist, and we also discussed the, quote, deep state, the permanent government, whatever term you want to use, the national security apparatus is, I think, the term you used. And we were just about to get into a conversation about the causes of the war in Ukraine, NATO enlargement. And the one question that I wanted to ask you then that I'm going to ask you now to begin is I wanted to understand what your worldview is. You strike me as a Wilsonian idealist. And so I want to understand both, one, is that an accurate description of how you view the world or what you think one should aspire to in foreign policy? And 2, what is your view of the international system? For example, someone like John Mearsheimer views it as anarchic. What is your conception? Those are my 2 questions to begin with.
Well, as you can probably guess, I don't love labels because I think that they oversimplify. So I like to describe things either in paragraphs or articles or books. But basically, I believe that peace and international cooperation are vital and achievable. And the difference between me and John Mearsheimer, who I admire enormously and like very much as an individual and like as a personal friend, is that he believes that in the anarchic relations of governments, tragedy is inevitable. His great text is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And his view is that because there is so much insecurity in an anarchic world, great powers are bound not only to jostle with each other, but to struggle for dominance. And if 2 are struggling for dominance, one wins and one loses. The setup is a zero-sum, or I would say a negative-sum game. In fact, the title, Tragedy, suggests a negative-sum game where the struggle goes on and in some sense a disaster ensues. So he believes that. I believe that cooperation is possible and vital. John gets a lot of credit, in my view, for accurate predictions. And I can mention several, but two that I would mention are his predictions that U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia, and specifically in Ukraine, would lead us to confrontation. He gets a lot of credit for that because he was very clear on that point in 2014 and has been clear on that ever since. And he also made a prediction which is, in a way, even more powerful, that back in 2001, 2002, when his great book was published, he said the relations between the U.S. and China are benign, but as China continues to grow, they will develop into hostility. And if you had asked me back then, 20 years ago, I would have said, oh, come on, John, there's no reason for that hostility. And 20 years later, his prediction was accurate. So I give him a lot of predictive credit. But where we really differ is that I can't accept personally tragedy as being the state of affairs and the inevitable outcome. I think we can do better than that. And certainly there is a lot of cooperation in the world, in our own immediate lives, in our neighborhoods, in our cities, in our states, in our nation. And I believe that that can apply globally as well. Another point, though, as an economist, where I take exception to this is on two essential points. One is that I believe that there are great gains from trade. So that's pretty deeply embedded in economic thinking. It goes back in its clearest initial statement to Adam Smith in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations, but it's proved in innumerable theories and empirical studies ever since. So I want the world to be interconnected because I think it is good. But a second point is I believe the world is inevitably interconnected on profoundly important challenges, such as the survival of our oceans, our biodiversity, our ecosystems, our physical environment, which is being deeply deranged by the scale of human activity, now over $100 trillion per year scale of activity. And we need to cooperate. We're not in a position to allow anarchy to prevail. There's one even more important point, and that is that ever since the dawn of the thermonuclear age, and one could argue ever since the dawn of the atomic age in 1945, but certainly since the dawn of thermonuclear weapons, we are trapped on the edge of self-destruction, literal annihilation of our species. I take that very seriously. So while we've had tragedies in the past, World War I, World War II, the 30 Years' War, innumerable tragedies that John Mearsheimer could explain very, very well, I believe we can't afford yet another tragedy of this kind because in the thermonuclear age, everything is different. President Kennedy in 1963 in a famous peace speech said, I speak of peace because of the new face of war. And he said, because of the thermonuclear reality, it makes no sense to talk about war among the great powers. So for all of these reasons, I am a believer in the potential for cooperation, in the need for cooperation, in the benefits of cooperation. And that is my guiding set of principles.
So I'm glad you brought up John Mearsheimer's forecasts or predictions, whatever word you want to use, about the rise of China. He made those around the time of the commencement of the War on Terror, and that was where the United States began to focus geopolitically its energy on the Middle East. This was just a few years after China was admitted to the WTO. If treating Russia as a potential adversary enforced a climate of mutual hostility. Why did the opposite not occur with China, given the fact that we've been so accommodating towards them? And why should the expectation have been, if we had been different towards Russia, that we wouldn't find ourselves in the mess that we find ourselves in today?
Well, actually, the treatment of Russia and China are the same, and the mindset is the same. What happened was that in 1991, December, when the Soviet Union dissolved, the American policymakers in the security state, and in this case, one politician played a very prominent role, and that was Dick Cheney, who was the Secretary of Defense of Bush Sr., said, okay, we did it. We've got it made. Our adversary has collapsed. The bipolar world has become the unipolar world. We can do what we want and should do what we want. That's good for us and good for the world. We've arrived at the unipolar moment. And that became the talisman of our age. Unipolarity, the indispensable nation, the most powerful colossus in the history of the world. These are things that Biden repeated until recent days. I think he's on a kind of memory loop, but that's another matter. But the basic point is that became the meme. I remember it very clearly among my international relations colleagues at Harvard in those days. There were many metrics of the U.S. as the sole superpower, the unchallenged superpower. Now, in those days, the idea that the U.S. would be challenged by Russia or China was unimaginable to these people. And China, much less than Russia. China was a nation of rice villages. It wasn't something that was on the radar screen.
Can I ask something really quick, though? You're correct, though, that the United States was the unipolar power. It was substantially more powerful than any country in the world. It was also the backstop to the international institutions. And so while you're correct in identifying Dick Cheney as being one of the sort of core advocates and then subsequently implementers of the neoconservative vision of U.S. foreign policy, which was very much more imperial, there were others who also wanted a strong American military and power, but for reasons that I think would have been more consistent with where you fell on the ideological spectrum, which was to support international institutions, to support the United Nations. So what would you say to that? I mean, is your view that the mistake was maintaining American power, that we should have demilitarized, or are you saying that the focus and the approach that was taken by the Bush administration in the 2000s was the fundamental problem?
There wasn't really that kind of debate. The debate arose over specifics. So first, back to China. No one imagined China as being anything more than an assembly shop for our phones and our computers and so forth, but certainly not any kind of threat in the remotest sense to the United States or any kind of rival. And the best proof of that, by the way, is to go back and read the documents of the 1990s. China's not mentioned in that context at all. So when it came to Russia, Russia was on its knees. And I wanted to help bring Russia back off its knees. I wanted major loans, debt relief, and so forth to get Russia back on its feet. That was viewed as kind of an absurdity by those who view the world as a zero-sum game. Why would we ever do that? Was the basic response. That's ridiculous. We've got them where we want them. Now, what we know is that the practical debate started within the Clinton administration on NATO. And the question was, well, what to do? Should we disband NATO? Should we welcome Russia into NATO? Should we emphasize the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE? Or should we build NATO? And this debate took place 1994, 1995. It pitted Madeleine Albright on one side, Bill Perry, the Secretary of Defense, on the other side of Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And in the end, the Albright position prevailed. Clinton, as always, had domestic short-term political motives. thought it would be good for the Polish-American community and so on. But whatever it was, he came down on the side of Albright. Bill Perry thought about resigning. He said this was a cataclysmic mistake. After decades of virtual brinksmanship and often to the brink of nuclear war with the Soviet Union, we need to build confidence. He was doing that. He was meeting his Soviet counterparts. He said, why break all of this? Of course, George Kennan in 1997 famously wrote that this would be the most consequential error of the post-Cold War period. It would put us on a path to a new confrontation. And I think Kennan was the greatest scholar-statesman at that point. He had been on various sides of this debate since 1946, of course. But in any event, he was very, very clear. There were dozens of senior U.S. diplomats that said at the time, don't do this. This will just create trouble. But the idea really was, come on, Russia is so weak. It is so dependent on us. Anyway, we won, they lost, we go on. And the first move of NATO enlargement was Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in 1999. And I think actually Russia swallowed hard. It resented it. It viewed it as contrary to the spirit of everything that had been discussed from 1990 onward. But these were countries away from Russia's borders. Things got worse in the next years. It certainly started with the NATO bombing of Belgrade, which was really an outrageous policy. It's a complete blot on American foreign policy and on Madeleine Albright. It was a deliberate war, whether to teach Milosevic a lesson, even though he was absolutely ready for many compromises, or whether it was to teach Holbrooke a lesson, because there's another theory which has a lot of credibility that she wanted to break any agreement that Holbrooke was negotiating with Milosevic in 1999, because if he succeeded, he would be the Secretary of State under Al Gore starting in 2001. So there's lots of gossip about this, but this was a disaster. And from the Russian point of view, this was an outrage. NATO bombing a European capital, a close ally of Russia and a historical, cultural ally of Russia, to break Serbia in two. And that was the next step. It has gone basically on that path from 1999 until today. And so it's not really right, in my view, that there were the kind of good guys that I more align with, the kind of bad guys, the neocons. There was a view that I think is a quite deep state view, consistent, carried out from the mid-1990s, first identified in 1992, implemented starting in the mid-1990s onward, lobbied for by the military-industrial companies led by Lockheed Martin starting in 1996 for NATO enlargement, with great boosterism of none other than Joe Biden, of course, who's been at that particular game for a long time, spelled out quite vividly by Zbig Brzezinski in two places in 1997. One, a strategy for Eurasia, absolutely worth reading, from Foreign Affairs, 1997. And the second, The Global Chessboard, his long book on the same point. But the idea was American hegemony across Eurasia, essentially. Again, China did not loom large because it wasn't viewed as a serious threat. But Russia was viewed as a possible future competitor and worth surrounding, for sure, in the Black Sea.
So this is what I want to focus on, because I think the case that you're putting forward can certainly be made, right?
Oh, a lot of people made it, by the way.
Absolutely.
I'm not alone.
So yes, and as you pointed out, George Kennan, one of the most famous and admired diplomats in American history, wrote an op-ed published in 1997 saying this was a bad idea. In fact, I think the op-ed was titled "A Fateful Error." So this case has been made. What I want to try to understand is, so it's easy to see how this approach might have made things better. But what I want to try to understand is why you and others seem to feel that it necessarily would have, which is why I brought up the counterfactual of China's military rise, because we treated China very differently than we treated Russia. In fact, we treated China in many ways with open arms. I mentioned the accession of China into the WTO in 1999. Well, actually, an agreement was hammered out in 1999 that set the terms for its entry. It was then given most favored nation status by the U.S. Senate, which is kind of wild when you think about where we are today. And then it gained entry, I think, in 2001, around the same time that John Mearsheimer published The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, and around the same time that he published The Rise of China Will Not Be Peaceful. So if people like Mearsheimer were ringing the alarm bell about a potential future confrontation with assertive China in the early 2000s, at the peak of good relations between our two countries, why should we assume that if we had been more accommodative toward Russia, that we wouldn't find ourselves in a similar situation today?
Well, first of all, we don't need to be in the situation we're in with China. That's also U.S. created. But
why is that U.S. created?
Let's get to that, but let's
sure.
Stick with Russia first. And just to understand, look at economic indicators. China was way behind Russia in GDP per capita and in every other dimension of military power and possible concern for the United States back in 1997, 98, 99. So I'm trying to describe to you, not that we treated likes differently, we treated dislikes differently. We treated unlikes differently. In other words, China was just viewed naively, by the way, in some sense, because these are bad economists, but China was viewed as a poor country that was going to remain a poor country and not much concern to the United States. So that's why we approached China the way we did. Businesses were making money. They were an inexpensive source of inputs for our supply chains. We had the idea of triangulation still, that good relations with China wouldn't hurt in our influence and power over Russia and so on. So China was just not viewed in the same way, and it wasn't substantively for another decade. What Mearsheimer is right about is that when China became a sizable economy and a force in technological innovation and cutting edge technologies, then we changed our approach. That started in 2014, and that we can discuss at length.
And again, I don't remember exactly what John said, but John's view is one of structural realism.
That's correct.
And so there's a sort of embedded determinism associated with that, and a determinism associated with China's rise, and its economic rise and its military rise.
That's correct. And just to tell you, because I speak with him, he's my friend, and my interpretation, and this is how our conversation goes. I don't want to misrepresent him because I like him enormously and I give him all credit for this prediction. But I said, John, when we started treating China like an enemy, it's going to become an enemy. And he said, yes. And I said, John, that's going to make a self-fulfilling prophecy. He said, yes. I said, but John, that's terrible. We're going to have conflict. He said, yes. I said, John, that's a tragedy. Yes, Jeff, that's the tragedy. So John is not saying that China became powerful and then aggressive. He's saying what you said, and it's a very important distinction. China became large, and therefore we went to conflict. This is completely different.
Right, but it's different than saying it's America's fault. It is different than saying America caused China's rise as a military power.
No. That's also, this is wrong, and don't put words in my mouth, and don't misinterpret many things. China was militarily very weak, actually, for a country of that size and that economy. So it started, of course, to build its military. But we are in confrontation with China right now. That's a different matter. And that I blame a lot on the United States. And we can discuss that in detail. That's a different matter. I would expect that China, as a major economy, would have a military that's not a tiny fraction of ours in many strategic areas. This makes sense, especially the way the U.S. behaves. But to have the kind of conflict we have right now is quite a different matter. But if we could just go back to keep the thread, because what happened with China started around 2014, the change of American mood. It didn't start in Obama 1. It's a phenomenon of Obama 2, second term. But before that, the situation with Russia completely poisoned. And it's important to understand why that is. And that is essentially because the U.S. security state assumed absolutely not only as a strategy and as a set of tactics, but as a matter of fact that the U.S. could do what it wants. And there's the famous discussion of Wesley Clark, which is very interesting and insightful. Wesley Clark famously going to the Pentagon after 9/11 and getting a list of all the wars the U.S. is about to start.
The 7 countries memo.
Yeah. He says, what are you talking about? He says, yes, this is what we're going to do. And why? Because if you listen to Cheney, if you read Rebuilding America's Defenses of the Project of the New American Century, if you look at the policymaking of Bush, especially after 9/11, but even I would say before 9/11, at least to the extent that the PNAC was a major player, the idea was we are powerful, we are unipolar, we will be strong, and we will exercise what they call the constabulary duties. We will be the world's policeman. You know, some of us use that as a pejorative expression. What do you think? We're the world's policeman? And they used it as an absolute positive. When you read Rebuilding America's Defenses, they say, of course, we need to assume the constabulary duties of the world. That's good. We will be the world's policeman. Okay, what that meant was we're going to clean up all these retrograde, lingering former Soviet allied countries, Syria, Iraq, Libya. We're going to take out these governments. And one by one, they tried to do so. And it's been, in my view, a complete debacle, a complete waste of money. But from Russia's point of view, they kind of had their jaw open. You know, after 9/11, the first reaction was, okay, we'll help you, even in Afghanistan. But the reaction to Iraq was, what the hell are you doing? We have relations there. And then one thing happened after another, which needs to be understood. And the American public knows very little about it. But one of the most decisive things that happened in 2002 was the unilateral U.S. withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which Russia had put great stock in as a stabilizing measure. They did not want an arms race with the U.S. over this. They didn't feel in a position to have an arms race with the U.S. And suddenly the ABM treaty and the intention to station anti-ballistic missiles, the Aegis missile systems, first in Poland and then Romania. So that was 2002. It followed 1999. It followed then ABM. Then 2003 was Iraq, which was another shock to the system. Then in 2004 was 7 more countries admitted to NATO. This was Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Take a look at the map. You're getting awfully close to Russia with that. 7 more countries. And the Russians said, are you kidding? What the hell are you doing? And we know a lot about that because 2 notable documents from 2007 and 2008 are well worth reading. One is Putin's speech to the Munich Security Conference in 2007, where he said, come on, we have tried to cooperate. We wanted to cooperate. We wanted to support you in the war on terror, but your behavior is really completely threatening to us. So that's the first speech. And he said, don't even dream of Ukraine in this. And remember that Zbig Brzezinski laid out the NATO enlargement to Ukraine in 1997. So this is important to understand. These are long-term plans. These are not politicians' plans. These are deep state plans. They get implemented with very little change, fixed rudder over a 20, 25-year period. And that's what happened.
I just want to interrupt you a second, Dr.
Yeah.
Sachs, not because I don't think everything you have to say is interesting and worthwhile, but because I also think that I want to have a structure here for people to think about things, because there's so many things that we're talking about here.
Sure.
So number one, I don't think that any of this was inevitable. For example, the way you're bringing up the sort of neoconservative consensus in the 1990s makes it sound almost like if Al Gore was elected president in 2000, that we would have gone to war with Iraq. And I don't think that that's true at all. We don't know.
I'm not saying that, but I can explain one thing.
Right. But I think it's important, though, too, because I think that, so I want to separate some things out here. Well, let's just focus on the Iraq war since you brought it up. So I happen to think that the war in Iraq, and there's also, again, it's also important because you brought up so many things here. You brought up multiple rounds of NATO enlargement. You brought up the withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty. We haven't even talked about the intermediate range nuclear forces treaty. But I think also we found ourselves in a dynamic with the Russians that became increasingly escalatory, where we didn't trust them and they didn't trust us. But that also brings us back to what I was trying to get at from the beginning. Actually, I'm going to take us back there, because this really was my point of bringing up this counterfactual with China, which was, I get the argument for why the initial round of NATO enlargement and the 1990s was the critical moment in which we had a window to bring Russia into. Actually, it's not even clear to me entirely what you're saying. Are you saying that it was an opportunity to bring Russia into the international order? I mean, how would that system have worked? But more to the point, we tried doing that with China and it didn't work out. And in my reading of the history, the Chinese began to really worry about American military power with the onset of Gulf War I, where they saw America's technological capability to eviscerate what was, at the time, considered one of the most formidable conventional militaries on the planet, as well as the accidental, though the Chinese thought it was deliberate, bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999. So it seems like China's decision to invest more in building up its military capabilities was not a result of America's 2003 invasion of Iraq, but rather a predictable response to what they saw as a powerful hegemon that they weren't going to trust no matter what, because they saw that power as threatening. So what I don't understand is, why would Russia not have done the same thing? Why should we believe that if we hadn't enlarged NATO, Russia wouldn't have looked at our military power, come to the same conclusions that the Chinese came to, and poured more money into building up their military, especially given the fact that they are an old and proud civilization. They control the largest geographical landmass in the world, made up of hundreds of ethnic groups. They're a continental power with many countries bordering them, which means that they are intrinsically insecure. And they were an empire up until the day they weren't. So why would we not have found ourselves in the same situation if we had taken the opposite approach?
Well, look, there's a famous cartoon that my wife and I really like in the New Yorker of a little boy running to his mother saying, "Mommy, Mommy, Johnny hit me back." And this is how I feel this argument is. We did the hitting first in each case. So, of course, Russia is skeptical. China is skeptical. We're the country of regime change operations. We're the country of bombing other countries. I just listed all the things where we went first. We went first by years, even by a decade plus in these cases. Russia did not want to rebuild its military to compete with the United States. It wanted security. But if it sees that the U.S. is bombing Belgrade, if it sees that the U.S. has backed unilaterally out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, Russia didn't do that. The U.S. did that. It did it one day, by the way, not for a reason of Russia. It did it. That the U.S. invaded Iraq on completely phony premises. And on and on and on.
Well, I think that was the most destructive. I think, in my opinion, it was the invasion of Iraq that was the single most destructive act in U.S. foreign policy history, because it undermined the rules-based international order, which was basically the entire argument for U.S. beneficent military hegemony. So the moment we invaded Iraq, we were no longer able to make the argument that we were acting on behalf of the international community, which is why I think we ultimately find ourselves in a position where we are today, where so many people are skeptical. Not just skeptical, I mean, they just view American action as hypocritical, which is why I think the U.S. catches so much flack, because we put forward these sort of international morals that don't meet actually the standards of our actions. even though I don't think we're the most
Can't disagree
responsible
with you on that.
international empire that's ever existed. I do think the United States is the most sort of restrained international empire that has ever existed. And I think in some ways there's a lot of, that's not sufficiently appreciated because of the fact that we've been such hypocrites. And that just seems to take the cake for everybody.
Well, let me just say, we do a lot of nasty and stupid things, and Iraq was one of them. So I don't want to disagree with you on that at all. Why did Obama and Hillary decide that they would overthrow Bashar al-Assad? Absolutely absurd, tragic, destructive, filled with lies. I happen to know some of this from inside diplomacy. Unbelievable. Why, oh, why the U.S., Britain, and France bomb Muammar Gaddafi's regime to smithereens? Some people say it was out of personal pique of Sarkozy, who wanted to hide the campaign contributions that Gaddafi had made in France. I can tell you, having discussed this issue for more than a dozen years with the top people around the world, no one knows for sure why such a stupid thing was done. But the U.S. deploys its force in many stupid and destructive and highly destabilizing ways. And when we come back to Russia, it was a sequence of those actions. And remember that this was part of a plan that was laid out to Wesley Clark back in 2001 and actually implemented. And the vision was laid out in 1997 by Zbigniew and actually implemented. Now, I have an old dictum, which is that the main job of an American president is to keep the foot on the brakes. And the reason is the war machine, the overthrow machine, the security state machine is always revving. There's always a reason to topple somebody, for God's sake. And a job of a responsible president is to say, no, don't do that. And most of our presidents aren't so responsible and don't understand that or don't care about it or don't really get the game that they're involved in. There is a theory, by the way, which I think is absolutely not an outlandish theory, that JFK was killed because he put the foot on the brakes to the CIA and to the security state. That's, by the way, not a crazy view, although it was made to sound crazy in the minds of many Americans. But I think it's not crazy at all after having spent many, many years trying to understand that horrendous moment in our history. But all of this is to say, by 2008, we could have known completely that we're on a path of direct confrontation. And this was spelled out by Bill Burns in his famous Niet means Niet memo, written in 2008 to Condi Rice from Moscow, when Burns was not our CIA director as now, but was our U.S. ambassador to Russia. And what he explained was that NATO enlargement to Ukraine was neuralgic, deeply painful and opposed across the entire political class. We've spent a lot of narrative time in the U.S. saying it's Putin, Putin, Putin. But the whole point of Bill Burns' memo is it's not Putin, it's Russia. It's Russia viewing their security interests. And I believe correctly viewing their security interests, by the way. So it would have been the easiest thing in the world for the United States to have just a modicum of prudence to say, you know what, we'll leave a little buffer zone. It's an old idea in diplomacy. It goes back about 2,500 years that you leave a little buffer space. And Ukraine was a good candidate for that buffer space. But the United States in this era has not known any self-restraint.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that we pushed the limits of what was acceptable with Georgia and Ukraine. But I just want to, and we can sort of wrap up this part of the conversation and talk about ways forward, because I'd like to understand what you think those should be.
Could I just mention one thing, Demetri, to you?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Which is that in the spring of 2008, I went to a talk by Saakashvili, then the leader of Georgia. And he came to 58 East 68th Street to the Council on Foreign Relations, where I'm a member. And he gave a talk. And just to tell you, I walked out, called my wife on the cell phone, said, this guy's out of his mind. Because the whole speech was, We're core to European culture. We're core to Europe. We're going to join NATO. And, they're in the Caucasus, right in, you could say, the soft underbelly of Russia. And the way that this guy talked, like that he had some kind of cloak of invulnerability, I walked out of there just to tell you at the moment, not ex post, thinking this man's insane. He's going to lose his country. And I called my wife and I said the same thing. And a few weeks later, he provoked an attack and then Russia landed in Georgia. And the whole thing was a complete debacle for Georgia, but completely predictable because these people lose their minds when they're told by the American generals, we got your back. Don't worry at all. And that's what we do for a living. We tell the South Vietnamese, or we tell the Iraqis, or we tell the Syrian opposition, or we tell the Ukrainian right, or whatever it is, we got your back. And of course we don't have their back. We're not all powerful.
Yeah. It's also funny. Has anyone commented on how weird it is that Putin invaded both Georgia and Ukraine during Beijing's Olympics? One was the Winter Olympics. That was an iconic image of Saakashvili eating his own tie on international television during the invasion. So I just want to make one more point, and then maybe we can discuss ways forward. And the point is that we all understand, critics of American foreign policy understand that nation building has been a disaster, right? So, for example, nation building in Afghanistan or in Iraq. And this was a core part of the neoconservative vision. And yet we assign a level of almost omnipotence to American power when it comes to its ability to shape its relationship with Russia and China. Now, obviously, these aren't perfectly comparable. We didn't invade Russia and then try to set up a democracy. But I think that just as there are limits to American power in the Middle East, there are limits all over the globe. And my argument simply is, and this is what I wanted to make and try to speak with you about in the beginning of this conversation, which is that while I agree that you can make the case that a different, more accommodative stance towards Russia might have led to a better solution or a better relations between the U.S. and Russia today, it's also possible to make the argument that it wouldn't have, and that it may have made the situation much worse, that without having enlarged NATO, the United States would find itself in a worse situation today should Russia have decided to grow its economic relationship with Europe and the rest of the world, invest in its military, and eventually we'd find ourselves in a new Cold War with Russia, and maybe even worse with a situation where you'd have a very strong Russia and a very strong China. So it's not written in stone. I just think the way this is talked about, in my view, is it falls under the umbrella of everything is America's fault. And I just don't think that captures an honest representation of what the world looks like and what could have happened.
Well, I'm saying all the things the United States absolutely did wrong, all the provocations we made. You're saying, well, if we hadn't done any of those provocations, it might have been worse. Okay, but I'm drawing a logical line from what we actually did to what actually happened. And I'm very dissatisfied by it. I'm looking at the actual history and the path and what was predicted and what happened. And I'm saying this was a debacle.
Do you think the U.S. should have demilitarized in the early 90s? Because that was the debate about the peace dividend. Do you think that we should have demilitarized it at that time? That would have been the best solution?
I think we absolutely could have accelerated nuclear disarmament with Russia and with other nuclear powers, and that would have been a terrific thing to do.
But do you believe that we should have divested in other forms of our traditional military, that we should have shrunk the size of the military, that we should have shrunk the size of the defense budget, and that would have been ultimately a better path for ensuring peace and stability in the world?
I think that there are two areas where we really make a mistake. One is that we broke the nuclear arms control framework, and this has been terribly destabilizing.
Absolutely agree.
And the second is we have 800 military bases around the world. Actually, best estimate, 750 in more than 80 countries. This is way too much. And I think that there are ways to get regional security much better than American military bases permanently stationed, for example, in Korea since the 1950s. And in Japan.
Do you think we should have shrunk the defense budget?
Well, that would have shrunk the defense budget, those two things.
Okay, so what you would only, just to get clarity here, you think that the issue was that we had too many bases around the world and that we should have done more to limit the stockpile of nuclear weapons and on arms control, but not necessarily that we should have shrunk the size of our military or reduced the technological competitiveness of our conventional forces.
Well, but just to understand about the budget, the best estimate is that the direct outlays for the wars since 2001, all of which I've opposed, it comes to at least $5 trillion. So that's a reduced military budget. That's in our overseas contingency funds. But that's a big, big, big ticket item.
Sure, I agree with that. So, but it does sound like what you're saying is you agreed with the policy of maintaining a strong military, just not in foreign wars and many bases.
I believe that if you overdo it in whichever way, you provoke arms races. And our idea is to be on a mutually reduced path of confrontation. You don't have to unilaterally disarm, certainly, but you can aim for a pathway of reduced confrontation and step-by-step disarmament. And that's what I believe in.
So you mentioned the assassination of JFK and the potential role of a deep state conspiracy associated with it. Do you have a view on the recent failed assassination of Donald Trump?
No, except it's either some kind of inside job or some kind of failure of the Secret Service that is so shocking that we need to understand this. But it's obviously not, in some event unimaginable, and how could they have done anything different? It's a shit show of some kind or another. But the reasons for JFK are much, much, much deeper than what we know about this particular event.
Are you more inclined to believe that this was largely a feat of incompetence? I mean, there are sort of two important threads to pull on here. One is the Thomas Crook part, which is, there are separate claims about whether or not he was sort of guided to do this by some, quote, again, deep state.
Yep.
And then there's the other claims about the efforts to degrade security of the Trump team. As we learn more and more, it seems more and more plausible, I can't put a likelihood on it, that there was an effort to degrade Trump's security. I mean, supposedly, this is also coming out of RFK's camp, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s camp, that he had been denied Secret Service protection, in part because they wanted to bankrupt his campaign. Trump was under a lot of pressure with all of these legal proceedings that put financial pressure on him as well. So you could also make the argument that they were doing it to degrade his security, to make it more difficult for him to fund his campaign, or maybe that they were doing it on purpose with the hopes that someone would take a shot at him. But that's one line of argument. And then the other one is that, this guy was handled. I'm just curious, based on everything that you've seen so far, where do you fall on this? Like, how do you view both of these and these conspiracies associated with the potential assassination?
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't followed closely enough. I've not been able to read closely enough. I've been traveling internationally nonstop, so I don't really have an informed view. What I do know is that Bobby Kennedy Jr. should have had Secret Service protection from the get-go. So the behavior of the Secret Service, one way or another, is absolutely unforgivable. And the politicization of security, no matter what the explanation is shocking, because it didn't really take a genius to know that RFK Jr. should have Secret Service protection. So somebody is doing things that are totally irresponsible. I don't know where on the spectrum the truth lies.
Yeah, I don't either. That's a great answer, by the way. I mean, it's much better than you giving an opinion when you don't have a clear one or you don't have enough evidence, which is what most people do. There are explanations on both sides, but it is an outrage what happened. And thank God the man was not killed. We would find ourselves in such a horrible situation today had he been. And some of the mistakes, like not being on the same comms channel with the emergency service unit from Beaver County and the Secret Service, not doing an in-person brief before the event, not putting someone on the roof. It's really outrageous. So we dodged the bullet there, metaphorically and literally. One of the arguments that Donald Trump supporters make for him is that he is anti-war. Now, I did mention that he pulled out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and I think it was 2018.
29. He notified 2018 and did it in 2019.
Yeah. So what is your view of Trump, of what a potential Donald Trump foreign policy would look like, or a Trump doctrine, if we want to even go there, in 2024 or 2025, should he take the White House? And what do you think would happen with the war in Ukraine, and how closely does that really align with what you think should happen?
I think he's, in general, a force of destabilization. I don't think he is a warmonger. We have the evidence that he didn't go to war during his term, so that's good. He certainly wasn't addicted to war making, and I really appreciate that. On the other hand, he made a mess of many things, and he made some absolutely horrendous personnel choices. John Bolton is one of my least favorite American officials.
Fascinating choice for national security advisor.
Yes, and he messed up. Bolton messed up a lot of things. And by the way, in Bolton's memoirs, he talks about how he tricked the president, to do this or to do that. So he's a very deceitful and deceptive man, not the kind of person you want as the national security advisor to begin with. So Trump doesn't know these people. He solved nothing during his administration. Every crisis we have right now potentially could have been resolved between 2017 and January 2021, but none were. Not with in the Middle East, not with North Korea, not with China, not with Iran, not with Russia and Ukraine. So no problems solved. Many, I think, exacerbated or just left a mess. So I'm not too enthusiastic. But on the other hand, I give him credit for not launching any wars. Obama launched lots of wars. Bush Jr. launched wars. Clinton launched wars. It's not been, and Biden has been awful, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, we have a crisis of leadership in this country, and it's not entirely clear why that is. I'm happy to hear your reasons for it in your answer to my next question. My next question is just about ways forward. So we talked a little bit about, though it deserved much more time, the attempt to create a new world order in the 1990s, a new vision for America's role in the world, because we had basically oriented our foreign policy towards fighting the Cold War up until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And we sort of, I think, afterwards found ourselves in the situation of being this immensely powerful nation, and with also kind of like a reluctant imperial mindset. We weren't U.S. political culture wasn't natively aligned with empire building. And so I feel like what we ended up doing was we kind of thrashed about. We started some wars here and there. Now we find ourselves in this perilous situation that we are in today, where we have a multipolar or new bipolar world. And we don't seem to have a consensus in Washington on what the correct way forward should be, so that we can both defend American ideals at home and protect our country and allow for freedom and security, but also not find ourselves in a situation where we enter into World War III. So I'm curious, this is something that you've thought about quite a bit. I don't know if you've thought about exactly how it should be done, but what do you think the correct policy should be going forward, and how can we achieve that?
First, I do think that it's not just that we stumbled about, but I think we acted in the belief of unipolarity. And we had a doctrine that was an official doctrine of full spectrum dominance. And we had an ideology that had some slight variations. For Bob Kagan at Brookings, it was so-called liberal hegemony. For others, it didn't have to be so liberal, but it was hegemony. So I don't think it was just stumbling around. I think it was a belief in American power, and maybe by some truly in American goodness, or in others in American interests. But it was a belief in American power and a great exaggeration of American power. An exaggeration in several ways that we've at least touched upon. One is we have real rivals that are highly competitive and quite powerful, and China is an example of that, and Russia is an example of that. Russia is not a gas station with nuclear weapons, as it was derided to be. It is a powerful country with a very sophisticated population and a sophisticated political leadership. And it is definitely a powerful country, not to be pushed around by the United States. And it became more so as it regained its footing after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So one thing was we just completely overestimated. Second basic point, which goes back to many of our wars, we completely overestimated what military power can do. You can win the battle and lose the war, if you want to put it that way, but you can win the war and lose the peace And boy, are we good at doing that. So we had no strategies in Iraq. We won the war with Saddam Hussein, but we didn't do better than sucking our thumb afterwards. It was a complete disaster. And I do disagree with you a little bit about that the neocons wanted nation building. Frankly, I don't think they give a damn about what happens in these places. But they do want quiet. They want American military bases and so on. The only reason I say that is they're so ignorant about real nations, economies, development, infrastructure, that if they really wanted it, well, for God's sake, could they ask one person who knew something one day in 20 years? Because I saw it pretty close up, which you could attribute to unbelievable incompetence, but I attribute it that it must have a strong element of not caring, that they couldn't ask a right question once about Afghanistan, for example. I know, I don't want to go into names and details, but I know Afghanis in the United States, PhDs, really sophisticated people, never asked one moment to come into Congress or to come into State Department or to come into the White House. Are you kidding? We got a responsibility there. We got American troops. We invaded a country. We're supposedly nation building. They couldn't even invite the most obvious people in the United States. Now, you could say it's incompetence, but boy, if they had $100 of their own money at stake, I'm sure they would have invested more carefully and said, my God, I got to ask someone around the corner if my money's safe. So they didn't do that. So to me, it shows they just didn't care at all.
No, I mean, I agree with you. And they had a vision and they wanted to enact it, which is why they were so eager to believe in and rely on people like Ahmed Chalabi, who hadn't even set foot in Iraq for more than a decade before the invasion. Folks like Rumsfeld, whether it was Rumsfeld or Douglas Feith or Wolfowitz, these people had a specific agenda and they were looking for data to confirm it. And that's all they were really interested in. So, I mean, no doubt about it. This is somewhere where we agree perfectly.
So to come to my basic point, it's the following. First, as an economist, I see the world in a positive sum way, meaning I want India to become a high-income country and don't think that that will hurt the United States in the process. I actually think it will help the United States. I wanted China to become a developed country and don't believe that China's success has in any way hurt the United States. So I'm a positive sum guy. And as an economist, that comes easy because it's pretty deeply embedded in our mindset, in our approach, which is we're after trade. We're not after wars. We're not after conquests. We're after higher living standards, innovation, and so on. So that's the first point. And I also do not believe the social Darwinist view that, well, it's America or China. The world's just too small for the both of us, which, was the driver of Nazism and driver of many other philosophies, and was a serious philosophy, by the way, a kind of Malthusian philosophy, that the war is inevitable. It's not just distrust and self-fulfilling prophecies, but the world's too small for everybody, so you got to duke it out. And we could spend hours on that, but I think it's absolutely just dead wrong. I believe that we could have rising living standards on this planet, and that should involve the poorer places catching up faster than the richer places so that the proportionate income gap is narrowed. So I don't bemoan the success of China or Russia or any place else. I welcome it. That's a first point. Second, I believe that we've entered into a world of major powers that are truly multipolar. And they're usually at the regional scale, not at the national scale. Of course, there are a few national superpowers, and the United States, China, and India are three, maybe the only three. They're all nuclear powers. They're all big economies. They all have a tremendous capacity. Even though India is much poorer per capita, it's a major, major power, and it's going to develop quite rapidly. Actually, let me add Russia into that because it's got 6,000 nuclear weapons, it's got 150 million people, and it's got the biggest natural resource base in the whole world and 11 time zones. So you could say 4 superpowers, U.S., Russia, China, and India. But then there are important regions. The Arab region is a region that is going to be an integrated region, the West Asian region. The ASEAN region is about 660 to 700 million people, and it's growing fast. Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and so forth. And it is a region that is going to count. I like the idea of the big regions peacefully cooperating with each other, and each region having a kind of collective security within the regions. So I like a European Union, a United States, Russia, China, India, African Union, the Arab League, ASEAN, dealing with each other, mutual respect, not coming too close to each other's tripwires, staying away from choke points, not placing missiles right on the edge, not having the AUKUSes of the world, the Quads of the world to absolutely put China on a knife edge, not to put NATO into Ukraine and Georgia, to put Russia on a knife edge. I believe in buffer regions. I believe in a little space. And I believe in an open economic system in which we're investing and engaged with each other. So my view is that we don't have permanent enemies. It's one of my favorite lines of JFK. Across the gulfs and the barriers that now divide us, we must remember there are no permanent enemies. Hostility today is a fact, but it is not a ruling law. The supreme law of our time is our indivisibility as children of God and our common vulnerability on this small planet. I think it's something to paraphrase like that. He said, basically, Kennedy said, there aren't permanent enemies. And it was that mindset of flexibility that allowed him to move from the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 to signing the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty with the Soviet Union in the summer of 1963. It was a great suppleness of mind and an optimism about the capacity for cooperation. So that's my basic approach.
Dr. Sachs, of course, I could ask you a bunch more questions. I have them, but we've kind of run up against the end of our time. I'd love maybe in the future, again, we can have you back on because there's still more that I would love to talk to you about. And I appreciate you coming back on this time to speak with me. Thank you so much. By the way, I'd love to do it again. Great discussion, very important questions, and it's a pleasure to be with you. So thank you very much. Thank you. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.